Hey everyone, thanks for tuning back into Fishing for Men. In the room with me today, I have
Cody.
Cole's here.
Hey, it's Spencer.
Hey guys, it's Billy.
and this is Brandon. Welcome back. We are in week 2 of our Easter series. We're calling it an unexpected coronation. But before we dive into that, I wanted to ask you guys how your week's been. And more specifically, have any of you experienced any random acts of kindness towards you?
Ooh, towards me.
Or that you've done towards someone else?
Last week at Costco, I took my cart back, and then there was an elderly lady who had her cart that was a little bit far away, and right as she was about to be done, I was like, you know what, I'm going to go walk over there and grab that. So I went and grabbed it and took it back for her.
Nice. I was at the grocery store and I saw an older lady like eyeing the packs of water bottles. So I stopped, helped load that in her cart for her.
Oh, awesome.
Big, strong young man.
I don't know if big, strong, or young. But thank you.
Mine today was at the supermarket too. I took a basket
Nice.
back for somebody.
Ooh, I like how you called it a basket.
Yeah, a shopping buggy.
I like shopping buggy even more.
The reason why I ask is I was having coffee with someone earlier this week, and they were sharing with me that their work every year does I don't remember what they called it, but like they do a fundraiser for acts of kindness. So they go out to the people around them and get them to pledge to do acts of kindness on Valentine's Day. So listeners, when you're listening to this will be after Valentine's Day. We're recording it before. So they just try to raise pledges. So because of that, there's going to be, I think when I heard them, they were up to I think they were pushing like 1 million of pledged acts of kindness. So
Oh wow!
I thought that was pretty cool. So
Interesting concept.
Yeah. I actually had coffee with the same fella.
yes,
He
I'm
told me
sure
that.
you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if everyone in this room wants to pledge. We can reach out to that gentleman and let him pledge or let him know our pledges.
Sweet.
Help inch him towards 1 million. But anyways, like I said, we're back in our Easter series, An Unexpected Coronation. Last week, we took a look at the story leading up to Jesus. And this week, we're going to dive into the actual story, and we're going to tell it from a little bit of a different angle than you're maybe used to hearing the Easter story. So looking forward to jumping into that. But I wanted to kick us off with a quick story. This is a real life story from September 11th. So I'll just read it. On September 11, 2001, Wells Crowther, a 24-year-old equities trader and volunteer firefighter, became an unexpected hero in the chaos of the World Trade Center. Wearing his signature red bandana over his mouth to protect himself, Crowther led survivors to safety after a plane attack. Multiple times he returned to the danger zone despite the risk to his own life. He was determined to rescue as many lives as possible amid the unfolding tragedy. In the end, Crowther didn't make it out alive. His selfless actions ultimately cost him his life when the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed with him inside. Pretty heavy story, not trying to start us off all dark, but has anyone in here heard that story before?
Spencer,
Yes.
didn't you mention this to me last week?
I did. So Tom Rinaldi, the famous sports broadcaster, wrote a book called The Red Bandana about that.
This
red bandana,
guy?
and that was the only identifying characteristic that all these people could tell. Is like, somebody helped me out, and he was wearing this red bandana. I finished reading this book when Katie and I were on vacation in Jamaica, and I am crying on the beach in Jamaica while I'm reading this book. I've never been more grateful for mirrored sunglasses until that. It was just this crazy story. And Tom Rinaldi is such a good storyteller anyway. So you picture it in Tom Rinaldi's voice, and it's really good.
Yeah, I'd heard the story too, and I think because of the red bandana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe not to the extreme of this story, but do you guys have any examples from your own life of something you've chosen to do to help someone else, even though you knew it would require a big sacrifice of yourself?
Going through it right now
Yeah.
as a foster parent.
Yep.
How's that?
Is the best way the way I tell everybody this is picture being dead last resort to take a child. but also knowing that you know the life that you can give them, and you know potentially where they're going back to.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do to change that. There's nothing you can do to fix it. There's nothing you can do at all. And I know we talked about this a little bit too. It's like being out on a boat in the middle of the water where you don't see any land in sight, and you're just kind of sitting there. There's no paddles. There's nowhere to go. All you do is wait. And each week is different. Even today, visits got changed up a little bit, and so Katie had to take visits today. For the next 6 weeks, they're on Wednesdays, and so it every time we have visits, it's something new. It stirs up emotions, and so it's not even just a sacrifice for me and Katie. It's been a sacrifice for our kids, from everything from time to sharing of toys, rooms, clothes, food, like all of that. So
Love.
we're still like right in the middle of
Yeah.
that.
It's been a journey.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Billy. Anyone else?
Nothing that matches to that.
we'll let Billy's story just sink in with the listeners. I don't know. When I heard that story about the red bandana, it made me kind of reflect on my own life. Like, how selfless am I? How willing am I to sacrifice for another? And not to diminish what Wells did in his story, but it also helps me better picture what Jesus did on the cross. Like, he knew he was going to suffer. He knew how painful it was going to be. I mean, we saw that when he was praying in the garden before he was arrested, but he chose to go through it anyways. And I don't know about you, but that challenges how I view power and authority too. Jesus, the supposed Messiah, not fighting back, seemingly just giving up his power. I think the author of Mark recognized that and wanted to tell Jesus' story in a way that helped his Roman audience see Jesus' power despite what looked like weakness and defeat in their culture, that Jesus was a new and better Caesar. So that's what I want to dive into today. So really quick, we covered a ton of ground last week's the previous episode. So I just want to do a really quick review of that to help get us back in that right mindset for where we're going today. We started all the way back in the beginning in my favorite spot, Genesis. And we looked at kind of the entire story of the Old Testament leading up to Jesus. Anyone remember who we started with? Who were the characters we started? Adam and Eve.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Very beginning, right? Yeah.
It felt like a trick
That was
question.
like a trick question.
I was here, but
I don't remember. Yeah. So sin entered in, right? And it just kept on from there. Their kids. Cain murdered his brother Abel, and it just like spiraled out of control until God was like, you know what? I see where this is going. So instead of letting them destroy themselves, I'm going to step in. Flood happens. Noah comes. Then we have things spiraling out of control again. They get taken off to Egypt in slavery. They spend 400 years there. Then we have another high point. Moses shows up. And he looks like he's gonna save the people. He does a great job, but he has his faults too. And it just is a repeat of that. God's people turning to God and then turning away. And the whole time, one common theme is they're looking for that quote unquote new Moses, someone that can come help them break this cycle. And so it's this story that just kind of crescendos to Jesus. And that is where we're landing today. So we get to the Gospels. We looked at those for a little bit too at the end. And we're going to focus in for this series on Mark specifically. And we looked at who was Mark's audience. I actually mentioned it a second ago, but you guys...
The Romans.
The Romans, yeah. So all four of the Gospels, they overlap a lot in the stories they share, but there's some differences too, right? And a big reason for that difference is because they're talking to different people. So Mark was a Jewish not officer. Mark was a Jewish author, and he was writing to a Roman audience. One of the kind of interesting things about that is if you were to go back and read through all four Gospels, my guess is you would choose this as the easiest one to understand. How many of you, show of hands in here, think that the Old Testament's easy to understand?
I am raising my hand. Just kidding.
I was like, no.
Like, please share.
Yeah, what's the secret that you've had? Yeah, it's written from. It comes from a different cultural perspective, a different way of telling stories, and so for us in our context today, it's kind of hard to get into that mindset. It's something you have to really, really, really work at learning. Well, Mark's writing to a Roman audience, and guess where our philosophy, logic, and all of that stuff came out of? It came out of Greece, which was adopted by Rome, which has continued on for the 2,000 plus years since. So we can follow this. It's a fast-moving story that gives us the facts. We like it. We also talked really quickly about what is a gospel. Like, we all know that word.
My favorite Greek word.
Say it, Billy.
Euangelion.
Euangelion. That's right. And it literally just means good news. We looked at how Augustus Caesar, we looked at his Euangelion. So the Euangelion was literally something that back in that time, all the new kings had, or emperors, or whatever they were. It was like their decree to be like, I'm your new savior. Everything's going to be great under me. So we looked at Augustus Caesar's Euangelion, and one of the lines from it literally says, the birthday of the god, or Caesar, was the beginning of the good news for the world. And if you jump over to Mark 1:1, it says the beginning of the good news, or Euangelion, about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So it's like these authors are sticking it in their face, like, look, we're proclaiming there's a new king here. So it's very like controversial. Whereas us, when we read it today, we're like, oh yeah, Jesus is king. Awesome. Which leads into what we want to dive into today, what our title is all about Jesus in the story of Mark being coronated as a new king. So there's a scholar whose name is Thomas E. Schmidt. He's out of Oxford. What he did is he went and he looked at the kind of the coronation ceremony for the Caesars. Caesar is like not a specific person. It's like a title, right? Like emperor. And he found that kind of all the different steps, and it varied by each Caesar. It was not like one set thing they did every time, lines up pretty well with how Mark outlines the story of Jesus going to the cross. And that's kind of the argument behind Mark was telling this story to the Romans for a purpose to help them identify and relate to it. So we're going to actually start that walk today. I'm going to read through the 9 steps of the coronation really quick, and then we'll dive in. We'll look at some of them. Today, we'll compare them to the actual scripture and kind of talk through them together. Sound like a plan, guys?
Yeah.
Sure,
All
go
right, let's
for
do it. All right, so 9 steps. First off, number 1, Praetorian Guard gathers to hail Caesar. Number 2, royal robes, crown, and scepter are placed on Caesar. Number 3, Caesar has a procession through the city with a sacrifice following him. Number 4, officials carry an instrument of death behind Caesar. Number 5, they arrive at Capitoline Hill, which is the temple to Jupiter up on a high hill in Rome. Number 6, Caesar is offered wine mixed with myrrh. He refuses it and pours it out. And 7, the emperor ascends up the steps between 2 officials. Number 8, the crowd hails Caesar as Lord and God. And then number 9, they wait for an omen from the gods to affirm that he is the true Caesar.
Hey, before we jump, I'm just curious, guys. Do you see, just off the, like, out of these 9, are any of them, like, sticking out already of, like, ooh, like Jesus did that? Some people are shaking their head yes.
Yeah.
Like what?
The robes. They put the robes on and the crown of thorns. Instrument of death was carried on his back, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then somebody else carried it.
Yeah.
Nope.
Arrives at a hill where he was to be died. Offered him wine, but it was
Yeah.
water.
I was thinking the wine part
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
In between 2 officials, in between 2 criminals. Billy, what are you doing?
It's pretty cool, huh? And we have
There's an omen from the God with the crap with the temple.
you can just take it. I think you know all the
Thanks,
points.
Spencer's gonna get it.
the Hail Caesar is Lord. Doesn't he say something?
Don't they put that on the inscription about him?
Yeah. There you go.
It's pretty crazy, huh?
Yeah. Isn't that
is
weird?
Nuts.
It's like you playing this, Brandon.
How How do you, maybe before we even jump into those, like, how do you start to see that stuff, Brandon?
What do you mean?
Like to our listeners out there, how do you start to like peel back the layers to see that stuff?
This
How-
specifically, I learned it from someone else. I go find good resources where people talk about this stuff, because unless you're a history buff and happen to know that about like Caesar and whatnot, I don't think you would be able to make that connection, honestly.
The cool part, there's even like more background to like the whole Caesar story and stuff too, of like how he became to be and when he dies and all that kind of stuff. There's a really big tie-in to it, and so it's really interesting. And I guess the point that we want to make out of all of this, even for the next like 2 or 3 episodes, is this kind of stuff is everywhere.
Yeah, like, sorry,
Even in the Old Testament.
Billy's taking us down a rabbit trail here, but like even the creation story, there's actually 2 mixed, like melded together. You can go around and look at the creation stories of the cultures around them at that time, and it's almost like a counter narrative to say, that's your story, but this is ours and we're different from you. So all of this, like, it's easy when we look back at these ancient texts to look at them in a vacuum and say, oh, it's just this like linear story that just goes like this. But you got to think like, we only see what's written there, but this existed in a culture with lots of people that had different ideas and personalities, and not everyone was on the same page. And they were also fighting with the people around them. And there was a purpose behind it. They were trying to tell their story through it. So yeah, there's all sorts of interactions with other cultures. And at this point in time, we have better records of what was going on. So it's easier to compare. Like, this is them pushing back a bit against the culture that was trying to engulf theirs and say like, no, this is our king.
They're like apologetics
Yeah.
for against other cultures. What I think is fascinating, that they tell a story at first glance, but there's like all these layers that the original audience, this would have like knocked them off their seat. They'd be like, what? No, that's not, no. That, like, we know that Caesar's the king, like that's what we've been told, and you're doing what? That doesn't make sense. He just died. Like, this would have knocked them.
This would be
back.
a dangerous story.
Oh yeah, like this was extremely provocative.
I mean, just think about Mark 1:1 that we read. It's like literally saying, we got a new king here.
Anyway, sorry. I just
Train on the tracks.
I love it
I
though.
think it's helpful to
No, I
get all
love
this
it too.
context, because you see people as actually people and not just characters in a story that you know nothing about. Like, I feel like getting the context of it all is fascinating.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's so easy to forget that this was a community. This was a nation of people with lives, and this was a part of it.
And I think it's cool that there's an agenda behind each of the authors. Like, it's not just Mark who has this. Like, Matthew has one, Mark has one, Luke has one, John has one.
They're all different.
Even many of the other books, they have an agenda that they're trying to tell, and peeling back the layers is what actually tells and reveals a lot of that agenda that they're trying to tell you. And this, over the past 2 years, this way of reading scripture has like just illuminated the Bible and made it just so fascinating to go read. Because I always heard, hey, there's layers to the Bible. I'm like, yeah, like, how many times can I read this same passage? It says the same thing. But then when you start to understand the context, you're like, holy crap, there's a lot here.
What's interesting is before, like, I started studying this stuff, I thought the Bible had layers, but I thought it was all, what's a good way to put it? Like, I thought it was all dependent on me and my mood and season of life. You know what I mean? Which I do think that's true. Like, different things will speak to you in different times. But like, in addition to that, this is like multifaceted, and it's almost like a crystal or a diamond, you know, where you look at it from different angles and you see different things.
All I think of is multiverse, like Marvel.
Yes.
Well, I don't remember which podcast it was. There's one that we listened to, and they gave this really cool analogy of, imagine you're on the outside of a room and you've been looking through the exact same window in this room for your whole life. But there's a window on the complete other side of the room. And now you've been placed in that window. Now your perspective has completely changed. And you're like, whoa, now I see this room in a whole different way, in a new light. I'm seeing new details. And that's kind of what this is like, is seeing the Bible from a different window.
It's life-changing, huh, Billy?
Cool.
Billy and I have a lot of side conversations on this stuff. I was wearing my Bible nerd T-shirt last week when we were recording. I didn't bring it for today. It's too cold out, but good times, good times. So let's dive into the actual coronation ceremony. So to set the scene, where we're going to start, Jesus has been arrested. He was on trial in front of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. They want him to be publicly executed. They're not allowed to do it under Roman law, so they have to get Rome to agree to execute him. So they take him before Pontius Pilate. Pilate doesn't agree that he deserves to die, but to appease the Jewish crowd, or more specifically, I should say, the leaders of the Jews, so the Sadducees, Pilate agrees to have Jesus executed. And so that's where we pick up. So we're going to go back. I'm going to read the step again. And then my buddy Cody over here is going to read the verse for us, and then we'll kind of talk about it. Okay? So step number 1, the Praetorian guards gather in the Praetorium, or the palace. Caesar is hailed as Lord and God.
And Mark 15:16 says, the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the Praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers.
Seems
Pretty close.
straightforward.
Yeah. Well, but so a couple of interesting things to point out. So the Praetorian Guard, the Praetorium is where Caesar lived in Rome, and the Praetorian Guard was like the special guard that were his bodyguards. So they would travel around, but I doubt they actually existed in Judah. That wasn't where they were typically stationed. So, and then why would the whole company of them come out just for this one lowly criminal? You know what I mean? So did that really happen exactly as that, or did Mark add those details in to paint this picture? We don't know, but it's something to consider. And also, just random history fact as I was researching for this, I thought it was pretty crazy. So apparently, although this group of guards were Caesar's bodyguards, I guess they also were involved in a lot of coups. And so eventually, after like 300 years, the Caesar at the time like abolished them because they killed like a third of the Caesars they were in charge of. Yeah, 15 out of the 48 that they existed under.
Dang.
They
so
killed.
really, they run stuff.
Yeah, they were. There was a lot of power
This is
grabs
like
and stuff
the
going on.
ancient mob.
They were bad dudes. Moving on to step 2. So a purple robe, a crown of leaves, and a scepter were put on Caesar.
So Mark 15:17 through 19. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail the King of the Jews." Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him.
Yeah, so I mean, we see the robe Spencer called out earlier, plus the crown, right? There's not a scepter per se in here that I see. No scepter, right? Like there's details. So Jesus's robe was purple, Caesar's robe was purple. I don't know if this ties into it at all, but the high priest, there was purple in his wear too. I think just in general, like purple dye was really, really expensive to make. So only royalty basically got to wear it. So it's kind of this, it's interesting. Why would they put purple on this criminal, right?
Yeah, not just a criminal, like a terrorist. Like
Yeah.
a national threat is how they viewed him.
Yeah.
Hey, here, take this really expensive robe.
Well, it's interesting though, right? Because the Jews viewed him as a threat to their existence, right? That's why they wanted to get him killed. But then supposedly these are the Roman guards doing this, so they're doing it mockingly.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet that the Jews seeing this are like, don't put that on him.
Yeah.
And then can everyone picture that crown of like leaves weaved together that the Caesars wore? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess that was a symbol of like triumph and honor. They'd wear that like after military triumphs, and apparently also in the Olympics back in the day.
Mhm.
Yep.
That was a symbol used for that. Jesus's was not made of leaves, though.
No.
Yeah, so they use that to torture him. Scepter, like we said, it doesn't show up there. I was like, is the cross the scepter? I'm not sure. It doesn't explicitly say that there, but one possible idea. Okay, so moving on to the third step. It says Caesar is led down a procession through Rome, lined with incense altars and followed by a sacrifice. Normally, I guess this was a bull.
Okay, so Mark 15:20, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
It's interesting. Like when I hear this, so we see the same procession between Caesar and Jesus, right? It makes me think back to like Jesus's triumphal entry, you know, into Jerusalem just a little bit before that, and now he's being led out in a completely different fashion.
Yeah.
So
Well, that
there's, like,
procession is actually a tie back to a new leader coming in too.
yeah, and that actually, I mean, that's prophesied as happening.
Yeah.
But it also ties into the whole Caesar thing. Like he rides in on horses, Jesus rode in on a donkey,
yeah.
you know. So there's all this like kind of intermingling of stories going on here. And so I don't know, like, I think you called it out, Cody, but it's like, as this story goes on, is Jesus the Caesar or the sacrifice? You know what I mean? It starts to kind of, those lines start to blur a little bit, which I imagine is intentional. Continuing on, step 4, an official carries the instrument of death, normally a double-bladed axe, apparently, next to the sacrificial victim.
Mark 15:21 says, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross.
So yeah, I think this shows like that transition, because before it was Jesus carrying the cross. There's no one really following him. That's the sacrifice. But here now the cross goes before him and he's following behind, right? So it's like that. He changes roles. It's like, what do you, like, I don't know. I try to put myself in the mind of like someone from Rome listening to this and what they would have been thinking. Like, I need to be tracking with it, and then here the story would kind of be like, wait, what?
Yeah. You're going to die.
You're supposed to be up there. What kind of king is this?
Yeah.
So as Billy and I were talking about, you know, like peeling back these layers, one question that I think both of us have learned to ask is like, when there's something in there that doesn't make sense, it should stick out to you being like, huh, why? Or if there's a detail that seems irrelevant in there, like they didn't have computers to type things out on. You know, there wasn't no Copilot. No, you know, paper wasn't, you didn't have paper, right? So you don't add in things that are irrelevant, right? And so I thought this is just an interesting little rabbit trail to go down. It's not, I can't prove it. It's not, I heard it from somewhere else, but I looked into it and I just thought it was interesting. So why Cyrene, this guy from Cyrene, Simon? And then on top of that, why mention his 2 sons? Like, what's the point of that? So
don't they show up later somewhere?
They don't specifically. Like they show up kind of like in extra biblical stuff, meaning like text and stuff from outside of the Bible, but it talks a lot, or it comes up in Acts, I think, a couple of times where they talk about there being people from Cyrene in the early church at Rome. I don't know, but you think about if Mark is writing this to the audience, and if this is a true fact and he knows this, and he knows these boys are going to be in the audience and they can be like, that was my dad, you know, type of thing. Like, it's just interesting that he drops that in. That could not be it. It could be something completely different, but I don't know. Just something curious to kind of pile in there.
Do you guys notice those details? Like when you read? Like, do you stop and be like, that's weird?
Oh, yeah. Constantly.
Because I know I used to not.
Yeah, I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I'm
Like
not there yet.
I would always just read past, and I think because like you grow up hearing the stories. Like you know, I'm reading the Bible to my son right now, but it's the kids version, and so there's a talking snake on page 3, And it just
That's completely normal.
It just becomes quote unquote normal, and then we become numb to it, and it's like then we almost get conditioned that there's these weird things, like there's a talking donkey, there's a talking snake, there's all kinds of just weird, really strange, weird things that happen in the Bible. And what's cool about these is there probably is something there. There's probably some treasure to dig up, because usually where there's questions, there's treasure buried underneath.
Well, that I was going to ask you. So, what do you do if you do notice something like, "Hey, why this?" or "What's that doing there?" What do you do?
Yeah,
Cody?
just try to, start doing word study, kind of reference what in the first century, what did this word mean and how was it used? And, what's really frustrating is when you come across something like that and it stops you and you look down to the commentary. My Bible has a commentary in the bottom and it's not there either. It's like, oh man.
I know it's really convenient when it's.
That was my cheat sheet. Yeah.
But I love that. I love going off, and it happens a lot with words. And then you guys are bringing up, the culture back then and all the things that were happening around, just kind of try to put it in your mind and walk alongside of it and, try to understand it better.
I think one of the easiest ones is the words, to see if it's shown up in other places. Because oftentimes the Bible will tell you a story, intentionally leave out details that are going to come chapters or books later. And then you're like, oh, that's what that is. And it's meant to do that, to where you then find that detail out and then direct you back to that story and then reread that story with that context.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh.
Yeah.
And it's just this constant, we always think you read a book, front to back, and then you close it and then you start over. But there's almost this reiteration process in the Bible that's really cool, where it's constantly directing you hey, here's the detail that you didn't know. Now go back and read that, and now read through.
There's that version, and then there's just where there will be a whole story, and they'll take one key word that's supposed to take your mind back to it. They'll bring it up in another story that's not necessarily related, but you're supposed to be able to just have all that context. One way I heard it described is there's a certain kind of tree. Do you remember what it was? I think this is in the Bible Project, but they talked about this
The ones where the roots
forest of trees where they just create this massive root system underground.
They're all connected, right?
And they're all connected.
That's in Colorado. I can't think of the name of the tree.
It's a certain type of tree, right? And so they talk about the stories of the Bible being like that. Like how they're very interconnected and relate and go back to each other. I thought that was a really helpful image for me to wrap my head around it. I was like, oh.
I literally just sent something about this to Katie.
Aspen trees.
That's it. Aspen trees. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's when I learned about it 2 summers ago, I'm like, this is amazing.
That is
All of these are connected.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
It's
one tree.
Interdependent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they look like one tree out of the ground, but they're all
rooted together.
One tree underneath,
And
which
it's
is really cool.
Massive amount. I can't even explain how many there are.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me
Very
of a
cool.
community or something.
Oh,
Yeah.
weird.
Oh, isn't that what we're
Here we
about
go.
here?
What?
Look at that.
But then that
Cool.
translate that to the Bible. You've got 66 books, but underneath all of it, they're all connected.
They're all
So
connected.
cool.
In some way, shape, or form, they're all connected, which is just fascinating.
And the cool thing is okay, if you go to church and you're always told you need to read the Bible and you're like, like that. I don't know. To me, I want it to be exciting if I'm going to read it.
Yeah.
That might sound,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I
Me
mean?
too.
So it's cool to think there's all those things. It's going to take a lifetime and you're still not going to unearth all of them.
Yeah.
To just discover and find out and stuff. It makes it kind of like a treasure hunt. And I mean, that's not the main objective, is digging up obscure details that you can link back. That's not why you read it, but I think it helps draw you into the story. And through that, God uses that to change you. You enter into a dialogue with God and what he's trying to speak through his word. You learn about his character. I don't know, good stuff.
That's part of the reason why the Old Testament is so confusing. It's written in a style to make you experience the text. It's not meant to be read logically, where it's like, okay, this step and then this step and then this step, and Here's your answer.
Well, and that's why, like we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
that's why Mark is literally,
Yeah.
here's step 1, here's step 2.
Because he knows he's writing to that audience.
Yeah.
But even in that
He's
there's
got
still
his own stuff.
up underneath it, which like he's almost combining the Jewish writing style with the Roman thinking.
Oh, you know who does really good at that? John.
Hmm.
Yeah. Different series. We'll talk about that later.
John, like JMC, like Billy's
Nah,
uncle.
not JMC,
Oh.
like
He's not-
Matthew, Mark, Luke,
Uncle.
and John's John. Yeah.
John's John, you know, like the Bible John.
The Bible John. Yeah, that John. Yeah. Where were we? I don't even know what we were talking about. Okay, step 4. We're going through that. Yeah, we were just
I think
talking
you
about.
almost finished it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about why does it talk about Simon of Cyrene and Alexander and Rufus? So I don't know. That was the start of my rabbit trail down that. I'd encourage audience members see what you can find. There's probably a lot out there. And that's where we're going to actually end our journey today. We'll pick it up in the next episode and finish out the rest of the steps. But what do you think, guys? How's this tracking along with Mark versus Caesar's coronation?
Pretty dang step for step.
George is giving us a thumbs up. He doesn't have a mic. I feel bad for him.
Any questions that arise as we go through this? I'm just curious.
It's pretty wild. I mean, I didn't know that about the coronation ceremony until you asked me, like, how does this connect to Jesus? And I was like, whoa. So, I mean, all of it is kind of what stands out as like pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Does it change the Easter story for you at all?
I'd say overall, no.
I don't think so. Yeah.
It doesn't. But I think it highlights, for me, one thing it highlights is, again, I get, like, if you think about modern day politics and how we can get wrapped up in that, and then, whatever your beliefs are, you think you probably have an image of what power or leadership looks like, right? And looking at what Mark is doing here, like, he's very intentionally helping take an audience that probably has a pretty similar view of power as we do and subverting that and say, it's not what you think at all.
I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but going back to the red bandana story, and I want to know if that person was of faith. As if he wasn't, God was definitely with him that day and showed him how to be like Jesus right before he died. That's where my thoughts just went. Like, the sacrifice that dude made, Jesus did the same thing for us.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you know Spencer from having read it?
I want to say, like, they make a mention of it that he was, but I don't think it's like something heavily to, but
I remember reading he was a part of Fellowship of Christian Athletes.
Yeah.
I mean, that,
Oh,
I don't know if that necessarily means
okay.
that, like, he was a believer or what,
right.
but
That does ring a bell, though.
yeah.
Yeah.
He had some familiarity. It sounds
The
like.
gist I got was,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this story starts, at least where this challenged me the most, is that violence isn't the way to stop violence.
What do you mean by that?
So in the Roman occupancy, that's how they led with fear. If you weren't going to comply to what they did, they would just wipe you out. And so they would just continue to do this, yet they created this huge path of destruction. Jesus doesn't come and say, hey, let me gather up my army and I'm going to take you down forcefully.
Mm-hmm.
He conquers them through dying.
Yeah, it's backwards.
Which is complete opposite. And so then it just gets into, for me personally, it challenged how much we rely on military for our security. Now, that's a huge rabbit hole to go down, but is that the right mode to take? Are we approaching that the right way? Is there a creative alternative, or is it just creating a cycle of destruction throughout history? And so, not saying my view's right, but it definitely challenged me in many areas to be like,
Yeah.
Well, and I guess I would challenge you on that, Billy, because yes, our military does that to protect our country, but we don't. At least I don't. I personally don't own a gun. I'm not arming myself to protect my family.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably sacrifice myself if somebody tried to walk in the house and do something, because I'm going to protect my family in that way. But I don't know. That's the way I would challenge you, is to think that way instead of thinking that we are part of the military.
No.
Yeah.
That's more of a general statement that
Okay.
we in America find security in our military more than
Okay.
we find it in Jesus.
Yeah.
And our first instinct is to fight back forcefully in any other way rather than step back and maybe think of, is there a creative option?
Yeah.
Yeah, which ties back into, like, I think it's in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus talks about, like, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turning off your other
Turning
cheek.
off
And that
the other, yeah.
that doesn't mean be like this pacifist and just
Yep.
turn your cheek. Like, he's offering that creative other option. Which
There's
is,
an honor shame culture there that we don't necessarily understand.
yeah, pointing out, again, this is another good example of what we were talking about earlier. Why does he mention a specific cheek? It's because someone in that culture would recognize your left hand is for wiping, so you don't use that. So if you hit someone on the right cheek with your right hand, it means you backhand them. And so not only are you shaming them in public, you're treating them like a slave. And so by turning your other cheek, you're not saying, I'm just going to give me another blow. You're standing up to them and saying, like, no, if you're going to hit me, treat me like a person.
Yeah.
And kind of like calling them out for what they're doing without striking them back. So I think that's kind of what you're getting to. Is it's like it doesn't mean you retreat and just hide, but like if Jesus challenges us not to use violence, what does that look like? What does that alternative
look
look
challenge
like?
that in a way that you don't have to be?
And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting thing to think about because I think we've been brought up that way.
Well, I'll tell you, like, my initial instinct is to be like, well, that's great if we take that attitude, but there's so many bad actors out there. Yeah. I don't know. Interesting stuff. So all of that to say, like, there's a lot in the text and it can spark thoughts about our own lives and our own context. So our hope is that as we journey through this story of Mark, that you'll feel invited into wrestling with what's going on. That it's okay to ask questions, and that really invites us into the story to better understand not only what the author is trying to say, but what's God trying to speak through this. Because I do think at the end of the day that all of this is inspired by God, and it has meaning that's relevant to our life. So, and through that, by exploring that, hopefully it will deepen your relationship with God. We're going to wrap it up on that note today. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll tune in again next episode as we continue our way through the story of the cross and Jesus's unconventional coronation. Thanks, guys.